Hello, SpongicX here, and I want to share my thoughts on the 2011 game Alice Madness Returns. Recently, I did a long two-part playthrough of the original game from 2000, American McGee's Alice, which is a psychological horror version of Alice in Wonderland. The first game showed what would happen if Alice's family died in a fire and made her go insane. The game follows an older Alice, as she was sent into an insane asylum, and one night she fell asleep and dreams about Wonderland after so many years, except now it's dark and twisted. The game has Alice explore the haunted ruins of Wonderland and fight off demons and corrupt citizens of Wonderland, while trying to sort her mind to save Wonderland and herself. Upon defeating the Queen of Hearts, she regains her mind and restores Wonderland back to its old self, as Alice leaves the asylum cured. The game was very memorable, despite being a very flawed game with wonky platforming and off controls. I did play the sequel on Xbox 360 back when it first released via a video rental. Hard to believe the sequel's about 11 years old now. I could have sworn I played this game back in high school, but this came out 1 year after I graduated. I remembered liking the game back then, but I remembered thinking it was very exhausting and repetitive at times. But back then, I never made it all the way through. I made it apparently up to Chapter 5, but didn't go any further than that before I had to return it and never rented it again. But I originally wanted to do a full playthrough of this game like I did with the first game, video-wise, a full playthrough. But this game dragged on way too much, relied too much on recycling of the same type of gameplay, to the point where I scrapped my playthrough plans. I thought doing a review would be more suitable. From what I heard, this game was supposed to be more fleshed out, but EA really interfered with the game, forcing it to get rushed without the planned boss fights and such, and a lot of story details. So upon revisiting the game and finally getting a chance to beat it all the way through, this game is a lot darker than I remember. A lot of this stuff flew over my head somehow back then, but maybe I wasn't paying much attention back then, I don't know, but the sequel was much creepier and more violent than the first. Much more violent than I remember, but Madness Returns focuses more on its narrative than the first. The story itself is very engaging, although disturbing throughout, so this game is not for everyone. I just wish the game was fully animated like the first. While the in-game models and environments in the sequel were much better than the first, it feels like many shortcuts were taken for the story. Most of the cutscenes aren't in gameplay, and use some sort of cut-out puppet-styled storyboard to tell the story. While they are stylish and visually intense, I still would have preferred proper animated cutscenes or in-game cutscenes, instead of the black and white cutouts sliding around the screen like we got. The voice acting, for the most part, is alright, although very hard to hear at times due to the louder ambience and sound effects filtering the character's softer voice lines. Alice and the Cheshire Cat have their original voices from the first game, and they sound as great as before, as if nothing has aged between them. Many of the returning characters have different appearances and voices compared to the first game. Some of the new voices were very annoying though, like whoever voiced the Dormouse and this Bottlefish character, oh god, it sounds like a more ear-grinding version of Dobby from Harry Potter.
Payday for bad workers is cancelled. A good worker is a live worker, free to live and work. A bad worker is a dead worker, and vice versa.
One thing that kinda disappointed me about both of these games are how underutilized the other characters were throughout the game. I mean, one of the most interesting things about the stories of Alice in Wonderland were the characters that Alice encountered. And you barely run into any of these characters. You only run into them about once or twice in this game, and it's all just to trigger the same chain of events. Usually you go to them, they give you a mission, then once you complete it, you talk to them one more time, that's it, you move on. So, yeah, I don't know. They felt even more underutilized in the sequel. In the first game, many of the corrupted characters were boss fights, and most of them are just escort missions, or not escort missions, but they're just, characters who give you missions and stuff like that. That's all they're used for in this. There are some characters who are set up like they are the big boss or enemy of the game, but nothing happens in the end because the boss fights were cut from this game. Some characters are even missing entirely, like the Jabberwock, which is kind of unfortunate. He's such a big character. It would have been cool to see him in 3D, HD I mean, but yeah, he's missing in this. And then characters who were in the first game, some of them get less screen time in this one, like the White Rabbit or the Tweedles. The gameplay is drastically different as well. The first was mostly like a third-person shooter slash slasher built upon the Quake 3 engine. The sequel is an action-adventure platformer with a lot of combat sequences. Compared to the first game, the controls on the sequel are a lot better, but not perfect. The game itself is quite glitchy sometimes with both its controls and camera. Otherwise, the difficulty is much easier in this game, but still a bit challenging in certain areas. While jumping was the worst thing about the first game, the jumping is heavily improved upon in this game. Alice jumps very similarly to how Princess Peach jumped in Super Mario Bros. 2 or Super Mario 3D World. So, where holding the jump button allows her to use her dress to float through the air, every time she jumps, she has 3 white butterflies surrounding her, which allows her to sacrifice for extra jumps. The butterflies reset upon landing or flying over a burst of air. The hovering and multi-jumping is great, but it can be hard to steer sometimes, and the physics feel very off sometimes. Maybe it's a level collision issue, but sometimes Alice's multi-jumps don't make her jump higher like it's supposed to. Luckily, falling off cliffs is a little more forgiving in this game, usually respawning you with full health at a checkpoint not too far from where you just died. The game is overall linear with a few hidden paths and items along the way. Each level usually has a few moments that require multiple paths in any order needing to be fulfilled in order to reach the next segment of the story. Alice also gets a nifty ability where she has a bottle of shrinking potion. Holding the L button allows Alice to quickly drink the potion, allowing her to instantly shrink so she can crawl through small spaces and find hidden signs and platforms that are only possible for the tiny eyes to see. It can be fun to keep triggering the shrink ability in order to find all the level secrets, although some of the invisible platforming segments do get very annoying in some of the later chapters. She can also use the R button to perform a quick dodge attack and L trigger to lock on to enemies, similar to how it worked in The Legend of Zelda. Although the lock-on is a nice feature, but the camera controls and angles during it are terrible. The toggling between enemies with the right control stick is very wonky. For the most part, Alice moves fine, but the level collision is very off at times. Sometimes walking into certain spots causes Alice to come to a complete halt, almost like she ran across like an invisible wall or something. And sometimes there are moments where the camera gets a locked or fixed camera angle, which causes Alice's movements to go haywire or cause her to run around in circles. Alice also gets an umbrella, which she can use as a counter-attack for incoming projectile attacks. Unfortunately, there's no way to guard or block enemy attacks, so the counterattacks won't protect you from direct melee attacks. The combat is a very nice improvement in my opinion, but not perfect. While the first game's combat mostly played like a PC shooting game, the combat in this one plays more like a 3D Zelda game. Your main weapon is still a reimagined Vorpal sword made to look like a large kitchen knife. Unlike the original game where the knife was a slow attack with a long cooldown, the knife in this game is much faster, allowing you to slash a foe up to 3 times fast with the press of the X button. Before a short cooldown time, you can no longer use secondary attacks like throwing the knife, but you really don't need it in this game anymore, since you can easily switch to projectile weapons with the R trigger. All the other deadly toy-themed weapons from the first game are unfortunately missing, but in its place, the annoying weapon scrolling and limited magic meter has been replaced with button-assigned weapons with unlimited ammo, but cooldown time for the projectile weapons. The first weapon you get is a pepper grinder, which works like a machine gun. Good for shooting off enemies from a distance with a bit of patience due to the cooldown time. Each weapon can be upgraded in the pause menu in exchange for the game's in-game currency, which are the teeth of the enemies you beat to the ground. Collecting teeth is surprisingly easy, and you should be able to upgrade each weapon before the final chapter. The upgrades make your attacks faster, stronger, and give extra uses before cooldown triggers for projectile attacks. The pepper grinder is also used for activating clock switches, which are needed for unlocking doors and raising platforms. Throughout the levels, there are these hidden pig snouts. When shot at enough, they'll sneeze and trigger hidden paths and collectibles, which are mostly just used for unlocking character bios in the extras menu, or finding more teeth for upgrades. The third item you get is the stopwatch bomb, a white rabbit-shaped bomb with a remote detonator, which can be triggered with the B button. Not only does it work great as a decoy when you're surrounded by too many enemies, but it might stun some enemies upon explosion. It's mostly used for these pressure plate puzzles that are scattered throughout the levels, where you place it on a switch that opens doors, switches, or raises platforms to the next area. The fourth item you get is one of my favorites, which is a horse head toy that you use as a powerful club attack with the press of the Y button. It is your slowest attack, but one of your most powerful, great for bashing enemies' heads in and breaking those who spam guard attacks. It's also used for opening like little tough walls that you can smash through. The final weapon you get is a projectile attack, being a teapot cannon, which shoots scalding hot tea bombs into enemies. It's basically a slower, less precise, but much more powerful version of the pepper grinder. It triggers just like the pepper grinder, but you have to use the left and right D-pad to switch between the two projectile items. While there are fewer weapons in the sequel compared to the first, each one feels useful throughout and is fun to defeat enemies with. But the combat and platforming gets very repetitive throughout, so as good as it is, it really outstays its welcome. Each of the 6 chapters can take 2 to 3 hours or more to beat, making what should have been a short and simple game into an annoying drag most of the time, forcing you to repeat the same enemy fight, same old platforming, puzzles, and minigames over and over. Oh yeah, did I forget to mention the minigames? Well, some of the minigames aren't too bad. Some are even optional to skip. They will easily outstay their welcome by recycling them throughout the game. There are a few hidden optional minigames hidden inside these giant shells. These basically contain a bonus stage. Upon completion, you can get 1/4 of red paint. Once you get 4 halves of the red paint, you can paint a white rose red, which adds another red rose to your health bar, similar to the heart pieces from Zelda. These red paint minigames can range from solving Cheshire Cat riddles, fighting in enemy gauntlets or time survival challenges, and extended minigames based on some of the chapter's individual gimmick minigames. More on those when I talk about levels later. Most of the chapters have the same tiring pattern of playing certain minigames over and over. It's bad enough you have to play them once, but sometimes you have to play them an additional 1 or 2 more times. Luckily, some of these annoying missions are skippable, like the slide puzzles, which honestly aren't too hard. Like, for some reason, I had trouble with these back then. I was terrible at solving these, but nowadays I can solve them pretty quickly. I was able to solve all of them except for the final one, but only because I didn't attempt it. There's one in Chapter 5, and I just skipped it. You do have the option to skip these little mini-games, but, yeah, so okay, I just want the game to get over with by that point. So, occasionally you'll get some rhythm-based minigames, and unfortunately these are not skippable. They aren't too bad or long, but what really makes them irritating is how if you miss a single note, you're forced to start all over, and some of these have like 2 or 3 phases. Not very long, but still. What really makes them irritating is how the frame rate during these parts are really bad, even when playing on a modern console like the Xbox Series S. And so, for the most part, I did notice the game performs a lot better on the Series S. The loading screens go by a lot faster, but even then, this part lags pretty badly, and there were a few frame rate drops during a few parts, and otherwise, the game overall looked fine, but there were some real annoying, like, texture flickerings, or some moments where the game was juggling between high-res and low-res textures, almost like how it looks like when you try playing a game on a Switch that's on multiple consoles. How the Switch ports always perform badly. That's what it felt like. Otherwise, the game's not as bad as I remember visually. I remember thinking the game's visuals weren't that bad, and upon looking back on it, some of it was pretty good for a 2011 game, but it's once you get to the Queen's Castle where the levels' graphics start to suffer throughout. Before I get on with the story and levels, I want to talk about the graphics and performance of this game a little further. Compared to the first game, the graphics on this game are a huge improvement. My only complaint is it feels less saturated than the first. The character models look a lot better, though, and slightly more expressive, with better lip sync and facial expressions. The body animations look less stiff than before. One of the details that really caught my attention was the physics and movement of Alice's hair. It felt so lively and animated as it flew up with each jump and fall from Alice. For the most part, the levels are insanely creative, ranging from a mixture of beautiful to bloody and morbid. The further you go through the game, the more messed up it gets. The lands look more like a Tim Burton version of Alice in Wonderland, more than the actual Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland, strangely enough. Unlike the first game, where the levels took place entirely in Wonderland, this game has a few short segments in London, before the trippy transitions to Wonderland. These scenes are more scripted, and usually I don't like scripted scenes in video games, but these honestly weren't very bad. They're better than I remember. It's really neat to see Alice's mind go from the real world to slowly transforming or fusing with Wonderland. The first game mostly skipped out a lot on Alice's personal life in the real world, or time in the asylum, leaving a lot of the game to be a mystery, like what caused Alice to end up in that asylum, what did she do, or how did the world see her, and the sequel gives viewers a slightly deeper peek inside Alice's tragic life, not only through Alice's lives, but even through the eyes of people throughout her life. We still don't get a flat-out picture of how mad Alice really was. We don't see her commit any crimes or anything, just mentions of people witnessing her stumbling into places and shouting about things that aren't even there. It was really neat, yet kind of saddening to see what this poor girl went through, especially during the segment where she has a flashback to her treatment in the asylum. I used to find the London sequences very boring back then, but I really enjoyed them this time around. I bothered taking my time to kind of sink in the atmosphere a bit, and it was a nice break of pace from the button mashing and repetitive insanity of the Wonderland gameplay. To go further into the game, I'm going to start talking about each chapter and level, which will contain major spoilers. The sequel, Madness Returns, takes place sometime after the first game, where Alice is starting to lose her sanity again, and has to go further into Wonderland and search through her memories to find out what truly caused her family's death, and why. The game starts off showing Alice talking to a therapist who isn't giving her much help. Alice is trying to forget Wonderland, while the doctor wants her to stay in Wonderland. I didn't think much of it at first, but the more I played, the more I realized that the doctor's advice was a serious red flag. We see that Alice lives in an orphanage with younger kids who talk terribly about her, either in front of her or behind her back, about her mental health, spreading rumors that she killed her family. As Alice leaves the building for a stroll, she finds a white cat, an obvious parallel to the white rabbit. As Alice follows the cat, she eventually bumps into one of the nurses who looked after her back at the asylum. As Alice follows the nurse back to her rooftop, Alice hallucinates the nurse transforming into the Jabberwock, so Alice snaps and finds herself falling back into Wonderland. One of my favorite moments in this game is the transitions from the real world to Wonderland, with the first being one of the most beautiful, starting off with a bit of a scare, then slowly descending into a more whimsical setting. The first bit of Chapter 1 has Alice land in the woodlands of Wonderland, where she reunites with the Cheshire Cat, who is once again serving as your cryptic advice giver, although I found his advice very unhelpful and unuseful in this game compared to the first. Unlike the first game, this game does do a better job at explaining how to play the game throughout, but strangely enough it's not coming from the Cheshire Cat. Instead, you'll just get little pop-up windows or bubbles telling you how to go through the game once you get a new item or ability. Eventually, Alice finds the Duchess, who gives her a pepper grinder and sends Alice out to find a pig snout, in order to progress further. Along your journey, you'll come across enemies to fight off, which are mostly these tar-like enemies, with some of them being infused as creepy baby dolls. Eventually, Wonderland gets invaded by a hellish train that starts corrupting the land. Alice wants to find a way to stop this train, and goes to the Mad Hatter for help. In each chapter, there are important story segments that sometimes happen halfway through the chapter, where Alice finds a door that's on fire, which leads back to her house, and helps her recover a memory from the night her family died. As the story progresses, she starts picking up on smaller details that lead up into bigger ones, like realizing both she and her cat were not responsible for the fire like some people hypothesized. Upon finding the Hatter, his body parts are missing, leaving him with nothing but his head. Somehow, the March Hare and Dormouse turned against the Hatter and formed their own demented factory that enslaves workers and produces killer teacups. This level got really annoying. Not only does it drag on a bit, but I hated having to hear the Dormouse's ear-grating voice, like constantly repeating the same messages over the intercom over and over. It got really annoying after a while. It's like it was funny at first, but man, it got annoying as it kept playing over and over. After Alice storms through both the Dormouse and March Hare's sides of the factory and regains the Hatter's parts, the Hatter helps take Alice further through Wonderland. After the Dormouse and March Hare die from a pretty hilarious robot malfunction, Alice finds the Hatter has lost his mind even further without his old pals being there to have tea with him, and he has no interest in helping Alice any further. He tells Alice to go ask the carpenter for help instead. In Chapter 2, Alice wakes up back in the real world, finding out she fell into the water and got caught by two fishermen's net. Alice wanders off through London again and comes across a sailor bar where her whore of an aunt works. Alice gets called up to see her aunt. As she arrives, she finds her aunt being beaten down by an awful customer, who then attacks Alice and knocks her out as well. Alice wakes up back in Wonderland, but in a more Arctic-looking side of Wonderland. One thing I love about this game is how a lot of the London sequences foreshadow the theme of the next level. Since this chapter opened up near the harbor of London with a bunch of fishermen and sailors around, it's interesting how the next chapter has a lot of emphasis on the ocean, leading up to the Walrus and the Carpenter setting of the Alice Through the Looking Glass story, with a more darker and demented twist, of course. The visuals during the first half of this are both beautiful and haunting at the same time. One detail I loved was the frozen sun. It reminds me of the opening line from the story of the Walrus and the Carpenter. The sun was shining off the sea, shining with all its might. It did its very best to make the entire evening bright, and this was odd because it was the middle of the night. The first half of the level mostly acts as an icy level. There's a lot of creepy frozen and half-eaten animals that are left throughout the level. Some of the enemies and obstacles here are pretty neat, like the sharks made of shipwrecks or these hilarious crabs smoking cigars with a cannon for a claw. Eventually you find the mock turtle who takes you to the bottom of the sea to talk to the Carpenter at his undersea theater. You are then forced to play a side-scrolling shooting minigame where you steer the turtle's ship like a submarine and bomb incoming shipwrecked sharks. After wrecking the turtle's boat and making your way to the bottom of the sea, you end up finding the theater. It was neat to finally see a more dark and twisted version of the Walrus and the Carpenter in this game, since they were not in the first. Although their role is relatively the same as their original story counterpart, it is much darker and much more twisted here. Their shtick is still to lure in oysters and eat them. However, they put on a bigger trap and performance in this version, I should say. The Carpenter is running a theater and needs actors and audiences to pull off a show. Alice tries helping the Carpenter round up his so-called actors so she can finally get a chance to ask for his help to save Wonderland. First, you have to find a strange bottle-looking fish for show tunes. Beware, his voice is ear-piercing. You have to go down different paths and fight off enemies in order to free these musical instruments from Tar. Upon freeing all the instruments, you're forced to play a dumb rhythm minigame. You also have to find an octopus who keeps fleeing and hiding in glass bottles. It's a long and repetitive crawl from one corridor to the next, activating switches and platforms just to get to the next set of bottles you need to smash until you find him 3 times. Like I said before, this game has objectives that could have been fine just doing it one time, but then you have to keep doing it like an additional 2 to 3 more times, and it just gets old really fast. Upon getting the show started, everything takes a dark turn when the Carpenter makes the audience captive, as he and the Walrus slaughter the actors and the audience and eat them in a bloody fashion. Alice learns the two have no interest in saving Wonderland and would rather pig out on seafood. The Carpenter tells Alice to ask the caterpillar for help. See a pattern for the game's progression in story so far? As Alice strolls through London again, she goes into a house of an old business partner of her dad's, who lives in a house full of Chinese art and pottery. As far as I know, this next chapter was really shoehorned into the game, since there was no Chinese-themed segment in any of the original Alice books. Apparently this game was made by a Chinese studio, so they really wanted to make a whole level inspired by their culture. The art is nice, but it really feels out of place from the rest of the game and setting. Alice finds out her dad's partner sold the stuffed rabbit she had since she was a little girl, and it causes Alice to get angry and end up back in Wonderland, but a setting where everything is made of Eastern-styled artwork. This is a neat-looking level, but it is honestly the level I hated the most, because of the mini-games and some of the little platforming sections here got really repetitive, but the exclusive mini-games for this were really annoying and very broken, where Alice turns into a Chinese puppet and goes inside Chinese wall art to go through 2D side-scrolling segments. These should have been fun and artistic segments, but they are totally ruined by unresponsive controls and terrible platforming. These are the most unplayable sections in the game. You have to do these like 3 times throughout this level. Meanwhile, there are these paper grasshoppers who are being invaded and slaughtered by armored grasshoppers, samurai grasshoppers, and you have to work your way through this tedious level fighting off the grasshoppers, and just to get a chance to speak to the caterpillar, who once again tells you he can't help you and tells you to go on to someone else for help, but this time he tells you to confront the Queen of Hearts, thinking she might be responsible for the train. Chapter 4 has Alice wake up in a jail cell back in the real world. The officers let her go with a warning. As Alice wanders out of the jailhouse, the world around her slowly distorts back into Wonderland, as she ends up falling through the sky, having to hop among a trail of playing cards, leading to the Queen's castle. The atmosphere during the first half of this is kind of peaceful and whimsical, but the platforming and puzzles is anything but. It's very tricky and annoying here. Once you get to the Queen's castle, the level gets darker, more exciting, and more fun. I mentioned how in the first game I liked how it seemed like we finally got an adaptation of Alice that remembers that the Queen of Hearts and the Red Queen are two completely different characters, but for some reason the sequel seemed to have forgotten that and treats them like the same character again. Since this game implied that Queen of Hearts is also the commander of the Red Chess Army, that really highly implies that they are both the same character in this story. I don't know why it wrecked continuity like that, but whatever. The Queen's Castle is one of my favorite chapters in this game, with its dark visuals, creepy atmosphere, and the intensity of being chased by the Queen's giant executioner, and the payoff for it is great. This guy is one of the scariest looking things in the game, with like the tentacles burging through his body and coming out of his eye sockets. It is just a disturbing sight to behold. This guy is practically invincible throughout this entire level, so there's no way of beating him. You just have to evade him, and it leads up to a climatic part where Alice finds a cake that allows her to grow gigantic size, ending up with her killing the executioner by stomping on him, followed by a fun sequence of controlling a giant Alice as she stomps through a card army and destroys the Queen's defense towers, leading up to her confrontation with the Queen herself. During this chapter, Alice gets a real disturbing truth behind the fire that killed her family. She realizes it was no accident. A man raped her sister, locked her in her room, and set the house on fire as he fled. Alice confronts the Queen, thinking she's behind the train destroying Wonderland, only to find out the Queen is not doing this as someone else is ruining Wonderland. Chapter 5 is honestly the most disturbing chapter of the entire game. Alice gets a flashback to what life was like back in the asylum, where we see her in a straitjacket and getting lobotomized. As we control this memory of Alice as she wanders through the halls of the asylum, having haunting images of her procedures, along with hallucinating Tweedledee and Tweedledum as her doctors. Eventually, Alice finds herself back in the present Wonderland, and she ends up in a setting called the Dollhouse, which is technically the final level of the game, since the final 6 chapters is mostly just a big boss fight. The Dollhouse is a very abstract and creepy level, with broken rooms and pieces of a giant dollhouse scattered throughout, with eerie music and creepy broken dolls and dismembered animals scattered throughout. There are barely any characters to interact with in this level, aside from these disturbing mental patient kids who were horribly disfigured in a gory fashion. This was honestly the most brutal scene in the whole game. It was hard to look at. When I first rented this game years ago, I never even made it to this part. I remember just like getting past the part where you controlled Alice through her insane asylum flashback, and then right when I got to this level, I stopped playing, and then I had to return it back to the rental store. Never rented it again. Not that I didn't want to, I just never bothered to. But so I finally got to play this game again after so many years, and wow, it's like I really stopped playing before the game got even more disturbing. But so Alice decides to try helping these abused kids, but by the time she returns later in the game, you find that the house is empty, and one of the girls is laying dead in front of the house, implying something terrible happened to them. Despite this level's morbid themes, this started out as a fun level, especially for all the bizarre hidden details, like pictures of the Jabberwock and Humpty Dumpty, who unfortunately were not in the final game. Humpty Dumpty wasn't even in any of these games for that matter, despite being a character in the second book. So you also find the 3 blind mice shoved into a jar at one point. There's a taxidermy of Pinocchio for some reason. Boy, I'd love to see an American McGee's Pinocchio game. As if the original story wasn't dark enough. Imagine what American McGee could do to spice it up. And there's also a clock made out of the ruby slippers from The Wizard of Oz, possibly a shout-out to the cancelled American McGee's Oz. Yeah, he was originally going to make a dark, twisted version of The Wizard of Oz, but that got cancelled for reasons I don't know. So all the fairy tale Easter eggs in this were very fun to look out for. However, after a while, the level gets more repetitive and frustrating, just like every other level in this game. But this is where it really outstayed its welcome. I mentioned how the other levels really drag on, but this one really, really drags on. I swear, it felt like it went on for 4 hours of repeating the same stuff over and over. Not to mention the annoying minigame of this chapter, where you have to steer a broken head doll and roll it down like these curving, swerving tracks to try to trigger puzzles and end it to the goal. So the first time you did this was actually pretty fun. I actually didn't mind it, but then you have to do it a few more times in the game, and oh man, it gets tiring after that. My least favorite part of this level were definitely the darker parts of the level involving where you had to do a lot of scale platforming and platforming across invisible platforms. And then not to mention the spike trap mazes. Eventually, Alice regains the last memory she needed for the mystery of her family's death. And she finds out who started the fire, raped her sister, and all that. And oh man, the truth is pretty harsh. Turns out it was her therapist. Now, this is both a good but very disturbing twist. The person she thought was helping her throughout the game was actually messing up her mind even further, not only in hopes of her never learning the truth, but also so she can try and sell off her as a prostitute. The therapist is a molesting pedophile who messes up children's minds and tries talking them into selling themselves off as prostitutes. It turns out all the evil dolls Alice sought throughout Wonderland were all the children the Doctor has corrupted, making it even more disturbing. Upon realizing this horrific truth, Alice ends up confronting the Doctor in the end, and fights off a distorted version of him in Wonderland, which leads to her killing him in real life. The Doctor's death was very satisfying. Alice was originally going to report him to the police to be locked up, but upon realizing the police would never believe her and think she's just crazy, she has no choice but to push him onto an oncoming train. As Alice walks away, the streets of London are combined with the forest scenery of Wonderland, with more whimsical music playing in the background. Alice doesn't know what to do now. She knows she can't go back home after what she did, and is now on the run, as she and the Cheshire Cat adventure off. The ending was very poetic and tragic. I thought the combination of both London and Wonderland was not only a cool visual, but a great way to visualize how Alice has really split between reality and insanity. Throughout the game, we saw Alice stuck in both either the real world or her fantasy world in Wonderland, with Wonderland kind of reflecting her mental illness. But the combination of seeing both at the same time really reflects both the growth and damage Alice has received through this journey. And I really hope the third game, Alice Asylum, does get picked up someday, because I would love to see how much more insane the series can get with this new world Alice has gotten herself into. Overall, I really enjoyed Alice Madness Returns, but it's better to be played in small doses and not big 2 to 3 hour doses like I did. Trying to play just one chapter alone in one sitting is way too exhausting and can suck what little fun there is to be had with this game. The game is faulty and buggy in a few spots, but it's still fun overall. This game is clearly not for everyone, and it is very disturbing throughout, even more than the first game. Either way, I really enjoyed it and wish the best of luck for this future of this series. If I were to give this a rating, I don't know, either a 6 or 7 out of 10. Not a great game, but a very enjoyable one. I mostly liked it for the idea behind it, and like I said, it can be fun in small doses, but it overstays its welcome very quickly. Anyways, that's all I have to show for now. Thank you for watching, see you next time, and have a great day.